Finally, let's explore the 3D features of Photoshop. Something we need to do in order to prepare for that is to save each of our material components out to a separate file. In other words, we need a separate Photoshop file for the diffuse and specular. This is because of a quirk in Photoshop in which when we apply a texture onto a material, if those textures have the same name to begin with, then they will always be linked or instanced to one another. So we just need to make sure that we start off with two differently named files, and that won't be a problem. Let me go back to open my most recent document, fuselagelayers.psd. And let's save this out again as fuselage diffuse. File save as fuselagedifuse.psd, and also save it out as fuselage specular. And on the specular document, enable the specular layer group and disable the diffuse layer group, and save. If we wanted to, we could delete these other layers too. They don't need to be there, but they're also not hurting anything to be there. All right, that little prep work is done. We want to be in the 3D workspace in the interface. Go to the window menu and choose Workspace 3D. And you'll see we have a 3D palette in addition to the ordinary layers palette. And the properties are big and visible here. We're going to work a lot in those windows. Let's open our OBJ document. File open. And that was placed in our current project. Export. Fuselage.obj and open. We get a new document dialog. The 3D units are centimeters. And let's make the width and height both equal to 2048. Click OK. It'll take a moment to load that OBJ file. Good, now we've got our object loaded into Photoshop, and you can see we have two windows here. We've got a main view and a secondary 3D view. I want to just take a moment to explain why we set our canvas to a 2K square. We need to be able to see the whole object on the canvas at once at its full resolution. In other words, such that an individual texel or texture element on the object is going to be about the same size as a pixel on our viewport canvas. The paint tools in the 3D part of Photoshop are view dependent. That means that if you dolly closer and farther back from the object, the quality of the paint will change. We don't want to dolly forward and back as much as possible. We want to keep it at the same distance so that we don't have that issue. However, we can zoom the 2D canvas, the viewport as it were, in and out, and that will not be an issue. Once again, our canvas needs to be large enough to enclose the entire object at once at the resolution of the final texture. Therefore, our viewing canvas should be a square with sides equal to or larger than the longest side of our final texture map. Cool, we've got that loaded in. The first thing we want to do is save it to a new PSD document. File save as. I want to save it into the Photoshop document in my current project. Photoshop. And we'll call it fuselage 3D paint.psd. And save. Now that has saved both the 2D information, the ordinary layers that you're used to, as well as all the 3D data from the OBJ file. Let's take a tour around the 3D interface in Photoshop. You'll see in the layers palette we have a single layer, and it's got some textures here and some lighting. If we added another layer, that would be as if we had created an entirely different 3D scene. So this is a 3D layer, as you can see by the little cube in the right-hand corner. We could add 2D layers as well if we wanted to, for example, put this plane in the sky in a photograph. If we wanted to import other 3D models, we could either import them into this layer or into a different layer. 3D layers do not interact with one another. They're lit and rendered separately and then composited in 2D like ordinary 2D layers. Cool, now let's look at the 3D panel, go over there. We have the properties panel open at the same time, so as we select these items, we can see different things. To manipulate our viewpoint in space, we can use these 3D mode buttons up here. For that to work, we have to be in the ordinary Move tool from the main toolbox over here. And the keyboard shortcut for that is V. So if you're in the Move tool, then you can click on one of these icons. The button on the far left is Orbit the Camera. And as we click and drag in the viewport, we can orbit the camera around our model. You'll also see Move. Click on that, and we can position the camera. And if we want to move forward and back, we've got a dolly tool over here. Click and drag up and down in order to move closer or farther away from your scene. If we select the scene in the 3D panel over here, we can adjust some of the attributes in the properties. You'll see shadows, for example. Let's turn those off. Also, remove hidden back faces. Turn that on. So that our lighting doesn't get overlit, we can also go into the environment section and disable IBL. That's image-based lighting. And now with IBL disabled, we have just a single directional light in this current Photoshop 3D layer. And that's the infinite light here. And if we click on that, you'll see that, of course, we can change the color and intensity and so on. There's also this very useful button here, Move to View. Click on that, and it will move the light to the position of the current camera. And that will fully illuminate the object quite nicely. If you go back to the 3D modes here, you won't be able to manipulate your view unless you have the current view selected. So I can look at the bottom, and then if I want to shine light on that, I can go back to the light and click Move to View again. To transform the object in 3D space, just select it in the 3D palette over here. And as soon as you do, you'll get a manipulator. And very similar to Maya, if we click on the arrows here, we can move in different directions. We've also got the ability to rotate and so on. But I'm not actually going to do that this time. I want to leave it neutral at the origin. To get it back where it was, I can adjust its coordinates. And in the properties, you will see that there are subpanels. And this is the coordinates here. And I can actually just reset the coordinates and send the object back to where it came from. If we go back to the current view, then in the properties, let's go to the camera properties, we can choose bookmarks here. For example, move to the top. And to frame this up better, we can play around with these parameters here. You'll see perspective, that'll change it to a perspective view, or orthographic, which will make it flat. We actually want it to be orthographic for painting. We don't want there to be diminishment of size over distance. That's going to affect our brush. So we do want orthographic, but we want the entire object visible. It's kind of funky what we have to do here. Click to go back to the perspective mode, and then just play with this field of view value. It's going to be different in every situation depending upon how far the camera is away from the subject. Let me try a value of, let's say, 90 millimeter lens, and then switch back to orthographic. And that looks like it enclosed the object just nicely. I can now go back to orbiting, checking it out from different angles. And if I want to restore back to that top view, what I'll do is, with the current view selected, go to the coordinates and neutralize these rotation values. I'll set the X value to 90 degrees and then Y to 0. Press Enter. Grab the Move tool. And now I'm back where I started. To make it easier for us to see, I'm also going to go into the View menu here, Show, and disable the ground plane, 3D ground plane. And I can also close this window here. I'm not going to need it. If I needed to get that back, it's once again in View, Show, and we've got the 3D secondary view. We can bring that back. We're ready now to construct our material. So down in our 3D palette, you will see jet fuselage is the object, and below that is a material. Click on that. And in the properties, we see all the material properties. And let's rename this, double click it, and just call it fuselage material. You'll see up in the properties that the diffuse channel already has something in it. Photoshop has created a texture already. And if we wanted to, we could edit that. But in fact, we just want to delete it or replace it. If we click that button, you'll see you get a pop-up menu. We could edit the texture. We could make a new one or replace. In this case, I've already got a base layer that I made in 2D, and so I might as well just replace. Click on Replace Texture, and in that same folder, we will see we've already saved out fuselage diffuse.psd. Select that and click Open. And it gets loaded on. To admire our work from different angles, select the current view, go to the Orbit tool. And if we can't see the bottom, once again, we can choose the infinite light and then move the light. We can go back to our material now and load the specular texture on. Fuselage material specular. Click to browse and load a texture. Now this doesn't actually make a link. It will encapsulate all this data within the current document. So you're safe to move or delete these files later if you want to. We go ahead and click Fuselage Specular. Open that up. And you can see we got some shininess there that we didn't have before. We can play around with these parameters too. So we're getting a high reflectivity or shininess here and little or none down here. We can now edit those textures. Let's go up to the diffuse channel, click on that and choose Edit Texture. And what this does is it creates a temporary file that's a smart object that's embedded in this file, but only temporarily. And so now we can edit this and it will reflect onto our 3D object in real time. But we need to be able to see them both at the same time for that to really be effective. Go up to Window, Arrange, 2 up vertical. Now I've got our 2D view on one side, 3D on the other. I can select this temporary document here and go into its layers and make changes. For example, I can go into the diffuse channel here and select these layers and do things to them. These are my type layers here that correspond to the lettering on this stabilizer. Let me get in closer. Select one of those layers, grab the text tool, and then click on it. I just want to reduce the size. I'll select all that type with Control A. Reduce the size down to, let's say, 18. And then we may need to select our other document in order for that to update. And it may actually be on the other side as well. So let's try going back over here, selecting this other layer with the type tool. Control A, 18 points, and then click on the other document, and you see it just updated there. All right, cool. So I can zoom in here too, by the way, in 2D. I'm using the magnifying glass and zooming into 100%, or I could just click 100% here. And if I want to change my 3D view, I could just click on Fit Screen, go back to the Move tool, and then rotate around. So I got my Orbit tool. We have to have in the 3D palette the current view selected. We've changed one of our color components, but not the other. So now we see this ghosting. We can correct that by duplicating layers between documents. Back in our 3D palette, select the material and go to the specular channel and edit texture. Now that's open. We can go to its layers, open up the specular group. These first two we can delete. Select those and trash them. Delete, yes. And then in the other document, we have these two top text layers. We can duplicate. Duplicate layers over into the specular document. Click OK. And now there they are. Okay, now we'd like to go back to our 3D model and see our changes reflected. But I do want to warn you that in Photoshop, I've seen a lot of memory issues where things were not updating. And I have plenty of RAM on my system, but I only have barely enough video RAM, which is 500 megabytes. That is the minimum. So that might be why some of the update issues I'm seeing are happening. But as you can see here, it's not actually updating. We can help it along a little bit by going back to our original documents here and saving them. File save. Close it with the right-click menu. And now that I've done that, you'll see it's been fixed. So it's a bit clunky sometimes. The updating isn't always automatic. You may need to actually save the open document in order to see the change. Cool. All right. So now our last item that we want to tackle here is to add an all-over texture. And now we will run against the issue of the seams. We'll go back to the diffuse document and then scroll down to the bottom of the layers, and you'll see you've just got a gray diffuse layer here. Let's make a new one. Make a new layer. Just select that one and then click Make a New Layer. It'll be constructed on top of that. And we'll just, for the sake of demonstration, drop a cloud filter on here. Be an easy way for us to get some kind of pattern on to the surface of the object. So with that layer selected, I'll just go up to Filter, Render, Clouds. And then click on the 3D document for it to update. And you'll see that's looking okay, but there's a really obvious seam. So how do we deal with this? If we go back to our 2D document, we do have the ability to view the UV overlays or not. We can also pan around here and kind of examine, try to understand what's going on here. A point somewhere along this edge is going to correspond to a point along this edge, but the color in those two locations on either side of that border is completely different. And so that's why you're getting a seam. We can paint over that seam in 3D, and we don't even need this 2D document anymore to do it. So in fact, we can select that. We can right-click and close it. And if we get prompted to save, we can save it. Probably doesn't really matter, but just to be safe, we'll save it. And then we want to zoom in. And remember, we want the object to fit onto the canvas pretty well. We also want to be looking at it pretty much straight on as we paint it. The paint system in Photoshop is view dependent, so it's very sensitive to how you have the object placed and rotated in your shot. So we'll go back to the 3D palette, back to current view, grab that move tool and the orbit 3D tool, and try to position this so that the seam is facing right at us, and that the entire object is visible. By the way, in orthographic mode, this dolly tool doesn't do anything, so don't be alarmed by that. Great, so we're ready to start painting. Let's get in closer. So we can select the magnifying glass and click 100%. And then go to the material. And then up here, you've got the ability to paint. Just click on the 3D paint button. You'll see paint system, texture. We actually don't want that. That would still maintain the seams. We want to choose projection. Now we can paint with whatever brush we want in Photoshop, but just keep in mind that everything that you do is relative to this current viewpoint. So if you change your viewpoint, like move farther away or rotate the object relative to your view, it's going to change the effect of how the tools work. If I want to paint over that seam, one way to do it is with the stamp tool. So clone stamp, here it is, or just the S key on your keyboard. We do want to sample somewhere on the model. Hold down the Alt key and click somewhere to sample a color. Maybe we'll go down a little bit further. We'll sample from the other side. You can see that the lighting is kind of blasting out. We got our specular highlights on there. Let's just isolate the texture so we don't see the lighting. Go over and select the scene, and you'll see surface is the current mode that we're drawing with. And the style will change over to unlit texture. Now the lighting's been completely disabled. All right, so let's take a sample here. Hold down Alt and click somewhere, and that'll be our sample point. How about there? And then scroll back over, and then paint across that seam. But I will have to do several samples, so maybe I'll go up here, do a few more. So you can see here, we're getting that line. Once again, that's because we have a border here. And that's being sampled in the 2D space of our current view. So I'll undo that. So it will take a bit of time for you to go around and solve all these issues. Other things you can do, for example, you can use the healing brush tool. Try that. And make it nice and big. To change the brush size, it's just the bracket keys. And just kind of drag around. And you'll see that's sampling from this area over here. So I've got healing brush, you know, that allows me to sample. Alt and click and then drag. And then of course we've also got the spot healing brush, which you don't need a sample for. Make that brush larger with the bracket key. And there will be some problem areas. You may have to go back to your 2D view and clean those up. You don't want to move forward and back. You don't want to paint at extreme angles like this if you can. Try to, you know, maintain a good solid angle so it's pointed right at you. And you'll probably be okay. You can tumble around and look at the object and paint it from different angles, and that's fine. You're best off staying with an orthographic projection, as you see here. I should also mention that that brush tool will only show up in the Properties panel if you have an appropriate brush selected over here. So if I've got the Move tool active, I won't see that. But if I click the Clone Stamp tool, for example, I will see the 3D paint options, and I can choose projection mode. Okay, I took a few moments just to paint over those seams. If we had more time, we would talk about how to overlay images and things like that, but basically everything that you know about Photoshop can now be translated into this 3D world. The last thing that we do want to look at in terms of editing here is just to change up the contrast of this cloud texture that we made. Let's go back to the material, back to the diffuse channel, and edit the texture. And go to its layers. We can turn the UV overlays on or off. Turn them off. And in the layers, down here we've got layer 1, that's our clouds. Just add an adjustment to that. Select it. Layer, new adjustment layer. Let's do levels. Click OK. And then the properties, we can see the input and output levels. Let's just constrain this to a narrower range. I'm just going to bring that black point up. All right, cool. And then save that. File save. We can close it too. And now back here you can see that it's much brighter. We're still looking at unlit textures, so let's go back to our 3D palette. Back to the scene. Set the style to solid. And we can tumble around again using the orbit tool. You can see we've got a much more subtle effect now. All right, then the last thing for us to do is to actually save out our new 3D version of the diffuse texture. Okay, we can go back to our material, back into that texture, maybe make any final adjustments. Say we go back into that levels adjustment and maybe bring the black point down a bit, give it a little bit of contrast. And then save. And also save as. Just save it out to a new PNG document. And that, of course, is going to go into Texture Paint Project Photoshop, but you'll need to navigate to that. So once you've got to that location, then you can give it a good name. So let's make it a PNG document. And the name, I'll make it Fuselage Diffuse 3D.png. Click Save. Look through the PNG options. Once that's finished saving, we can go ahead and close it. And then go over to the specular, open that up as well, and save it too. File Save As. And once again, into that same folder, and you will need to navigate for it. In your current project's Photoshop folder, And give it a name, Fuselage Specular 3D. And once again, make it a PNG file. Click Save. Go ahead and close it. Once again, save the 3D version. We need to simply place our new PNG document into our source images. Here we've got Fuselage Diffuse 3D and Fuselage Specular 3D. Select those and copy them. Put them into the source images. And then go back to Maya. Here's our last version, which was version 5. Select the object. Go to the attributes, Control A. To the shader. And we just want to replace the files inside these nodes. Go to the color channel. And browse for a different image. It's going to be Diffuse 3D. We can deselect and see what we've got. That's good. Reselect, go back to the specular color down here and replace that, specular3d.png. And there we go. We've got a texture applied onto the surface of our model. And there are really no seams anywhere. If we look really closely, we might see a seam, but this texture has been dimmed down so much that I've kind of hidden the ability to see seams. So it's been a bit tricky here. So that is our tutorial on texture paint using both 2D and 3D methods in Photoshop. I hope that you've enjoyed this and learned a lot, and you can extend this to your own work. If you want to learn more about Maya, keep checking Digital Arts Guild. And of course, I recommend getting a subscription to lynda.com, where we can go into the Maya interface in even more depth. Thank you very much for watching.